The first thing you notice is the man standing instead of sitting, half in shadow, his hand relaxed but hovering just inches from his coat pocket, while every other man in the room pretends not to look at him. The photograph is frozen in silence. Cigarette smoke hangs low like fog. A glass sweats on the table, untouched. And in the background, barely circled in red, there's a chair pushed back too far, as if someone stood up too fast or never sat down at all. This image was taken in Harlem, late 1930s. No gunshots, no blood, no chaos. Just powerful men holding their breath. Because in that exact second, a white mobster had just said a word he couldn't take back. And the man standing in the shadows was Bumpy Johnson. Most people think violence starts with fists or bullets, but in rooms like this, it starts with disrespect. The photo doesn't show mouths moving, but you can feel the word hanging in the air, heavier than smoke. A slur, quietly said, almost casual, like it didn't matter. Bumpy didn't flinch. That's a detail people miss. No reaction, no anger on his face. Just that still hand near his coat, and eyes locked on the man who thought power only came in one color. Everyone else in the room knew what that posture meant. This wasn't about rage. This was about control, and whatever Bumpy was about to say next would decide who walked out breathing. The image doesn't tell you who spoke first. It doesn't show the man's lips forming the word, or the way his voice carried just a little too loud for a room that powerful. But you can tell it happened by what's missing: laughter. In meetings like this, there's always noise. Chairs scrape. Glasses clink. Someone jokes to remind everyone they're friends. In this photo, none of that exists. Look closer at the table. One glass is full, another is empty. The empty one belonged to the man who spoke. He'd already finished his drink before the word left his mouth, like he thought the conversation was over, like he believed nothing serious could happen to him here. That's the arrogance you can't see unless you've lived long enough to recognize it. Bumpy knew it too. You can tell by the way his shoulders aren't squared for a fight. They're relaxed. He's not preparing to explode. He's preparing to teach. That's what separates men who survive from men who become stories whispered on street corners. Bumpy had learned long ago that violence was loud, but fear was permanent. The photograph captures the exact moment everyone else realizes this isn't their conversation anymore. One man avoids eye contact completely, staring at the ashtray like it might save him. Another leans back just enough to create distance. The kind you create when you know someone else might die and you don't want blood on your shoes. These aren't cowards, they're professionals who recognize a shift in power when they see one. Most people would have missed the smallest detail. The man behind Bumpy barely visible near the wall. He's not seated, he's not drinking, he's watching the door. That wasn't planned, that's instinct, and instinct only shows up when danger has already entered the room. Whatever was said next didn't need volume. It didn't need anger. It only needed to land. And in this photograph, you can almost hear the silence stretching, waiting for Bumpy Johnson to speak. Power doesn't announce itself in rooms like this. It reveals itself through who stays calm. The image catches that imbalance perfectly. The men sitting down are supposed to be in charge. Italian suits, polished shoes, rings heavy enough to crack teeth, but their bodies betray them. Knees angled away, hands flat on the table. They're listening now, not leading. Bumpy is still standing. That matters. In the old Harlem underworld, standing while others sit wasn't accidental. It was a silent challenge. It meant you hadn't agreed to anything yet. It meant you could still walk away or make everyone else wish they could. The photograph freezes him mid-decision, and that's what makes it dangerous. If you zoom into his face, there's no rage, no humiliation, just calculation. Bumpy had been called worse in his life, on the streets, in prison, by cops who thought a badge made them gods. But this wasn't the street. This wasn't prison. This was supposed to be business, and business had rules. The men across from him understood that too late. You can see it in the way one of them subtly adjusts his tie, as if tightening it might restore authority. Another clears his throat but doesn't speak. No one interrupts Bumpy, not because they respect him, but because they're afraid of what happens if they do. This is where most people misunderstand power. They think it's about who brought the most soldiers or who controls the most money. In this room, power belonged to the man who could sit in silence without blinking, the man who didn't rush his response because he knew time was on his side. Bumpy's hand finally moves, not toward the gun, but away from it. Slow, deliberate, a message without words, I don't need it yet. That single motion tells the room everything. Violence is an option, just not the first one. If you were there, would you have noticed how the air changed? How every breath got shorter? How nobody reached for their drink anymore? Because the moment Bumpy opened his mouth, the balance would tip. And once it did, there would be no going back. The hidden threat in this image isn't a gun. It's not the man by the door, it's not even Bumpy Johnson himself. It's the fact that everyone in the room suddenly understands something they didn't when they walked in. This meeting is no longer controlled by the Mafia. Look at the background again. The man standing near the wall hasn't moved, but his eyes have shifted. He's no longer watching the door. He's watching the Italians. That's the detail most people miss. Doors matter when you're afraid of outsiders. Eyes matter when you're afraid of someone already inside the room. Bumpy takes one slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just close enough that the man who spoke can smell his cologne mixed with cigarette smoke. That distance is intentional. Too far and it's weakness. Too close and it's a threat. Bumpy stops exactly where respect should have started. Inside his head there's no anger, only memory, prison yards, beatings. Watching men die over smaller insults, he knows something these men don't. Words don't just reflect power. They challenge it, and challenges demand answers. One of the mobsters shifts in his chair, and it makes a soft sound against the floor. Too loud. Everyone hears it. Everyone feels it. This is where survival instincts fail. When grown men realize they're no longer spectators, they're witnesses. The man who spoke tries to smile. It's forced. His mouth moves, but nothing comes out. He's waiting for someone else to save him. Lucky Luciano isn't. No boss is stepping in. In this room, alliances mean nothing if respect is gone. Bumpy finally speaks, not yet loud enough to hear in the photograph, but loud enough to shut down the room. His voice doesn't rise, it drops. That's the real danger. Men who yell want to be heard. Men who lower their voice want to be obeyed. If you were there, you might have thought this was still fixable, a joke, an apology, a drink poured to smooth it over. But the image tells the truth. The threat was already alive. And in the next moment, 6 words would be spoken that would terrify men who had ordered murders without blinking. The moment it turned deadly wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or slammed fists. It came with 6 words, delivered so calmly that the photograph almost feels cursed for capturing the second before they landed. Bumpy doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't lean in. He simply tilts his head, just enough to let the man who spoke understand he has Bumpy's full attention. That tilt mattered. In Harlem, that was the posture of a man deciding whether another man still had a future. The room goes so quiet you can hear the building breathe. Steam hisses somewhere in the pipes. A cigarette burns too long in an ashtray and curls into itself. No one interrupts because everyone knows interruptions end conversations. And conversations are the only thing keeping this from becoming a killing. Bumpy speaks, 6 words, flat, even, almost polite, not a threat, a verdict. The photograph doesn't record sound, but every man in that room felt it hit their chest. Because what Bumpy said wasn't about race anymore. It was about ownership, about territory, about how quickly respect could be replaced with consequence. The man who used the slur goes pale. That's the detail people miss. Not anger. Fear, real fear, the kind that drains blood from your face when you realize you misjudged the room, the man, and your own importance. His eyes flick to the others, searching for backup. He finds none, not because they don't like him, but because they understand the math. Backing him now means war in Harlem, means losing routes, protection, money, and sleep, means explaining to their bosses why black neighborhoods suddenly became hostile territory, and all over a word that should have never been said. Someone finally reaches for a glass, but their hand shakes just enough to spill a drop on the table. That drop spreads slowly, creeping toward the edge. In this world, spills mean messes. Messes mean attention. Attention means body. Bumpy doesn't move after he speaks. That's the deadliest part. He lets the words sit there, heavy and unanswered. He wants them to understand that what happens next is their choice. But the outcome is already decided. Most people think power is proven through action. In this moment, power is proven through restraint. Because everyone in the room knows that if Bumpy wanted violence, it would have already happened. The fact that it hasn't is what terrifies them. The photograph captures the instant right after the 6 words, when every man realizes they're no longer negotiating, they're surviving. The immediate aftermath doesn't show panic, it shows obedience. That's what makes the image so unsettling. No one jumps up, no one reaches for a weapon. The men who built empires on blood suddenly become careful with their movements, like the room itself might be watching. The man who spoke finally nods. Just once. It's small, almost invisible, but in this world it's an apology without words. His mouth opens again. But this time what comes out is softer, controlled, respectful, the kind of tone you use when you realize you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed, only survived. Bumpy listens without reacting. He doesn't interrupt, he doesn't smile. He lets the man finish because humiliation works best when it's allowed to breathe. The others stay silent, pretending to study the table, the smoke, the cracks in the walls. Anything except Bumpy's face. Looking at him now feels dangerous, like eye contact could be mistaken for defiance. The glass that spilled earlier reaches the edge of the table and finally drops to the floor. It doesn't shatter, it just rolls slow and loud until it stops near Bumpy's shoe. No one moves to pick it up. Everyone notices where it stops, right at his feet, as if the room itself is underlining the point. Bumpy steps back, reclaiming his space. That movement releases the tension just enough for people to breathe again, but not enough to relax. The man by the door shifts his weight for the first time since it started, reassured that violence has been postponed, not canceled. This is where most people misunderstand what just happened. They think the danger passed. It didn't. It changed shape, from immediate death to long memory, from tonight to every meeting that comes after. Every future deal will carry this moment like a shadow. No one suggests another drink. No one cracks a joke. The meeting ends early, not because it's finished, but because it's settled. There's nothing left to discuss when one man has proven he can silence the room without lifting a hand. As chairs scrape back and coats are grabbed, something else lingers, a quiet understanding that Harlem just shifted slightly but permanently. Boundaries have been redrawn without ink or blood, just words. And on the streets outside, that understanding is about to spread. The street reaction never shows up in photographs, but it's always the loudest part of the story. By the time the men from that room step back onto the sidewalk, Harlem already feels different, like the air itself knows something happened behind closed doors. Word doesn't travel fast. It travels precise. No names, no quotes, just a sentence whispered from one corner to the next. Bumpy shut it down. That's all it takes. In this world, details are dangerous, but conclusions are useful. The Italians move carefully that night. Cars roll slower through certain blocks. Eyes stay forward, no unnecessary stops. Men who normally walk like they own the pavement suddenly remember where they are. Respect isn't enforced with bullets here, it's enforced with memory. Inside bars and backrooms, people talk in lowered voices. Not about insults, not about race. About control. About how one word almost started a war no one was ready for. About how Bumpy Johnson didn't raise a hand, didn't call for muscle, didn't make threats, and still walked out with Harlem intact. Most people would have missed why this mattered. They'd think it was pride, ego. But this is where survival instincts evolve. Bumpy showed that night that Harlem wasn't just territory, it was his. Not because he was loud, but because he was unmovable. You can see it in how people behave afterward. White mob guys don't sit unless Bumpy sits. Jokes get filtered. Language gets careful. Meetings get shorter. These aren't signs of fear in the obvious sense. They're signs of respect born from understanding consequences. Because that's the lesson. Bumpy didn't need to kill him to destroy his authority. Letting him live with that moment was punishment enough. If you were there, you might have felt safer knowing Bumpy was in charge, or more afraid, realizing how quietly power could be taken away. Either way, the streets learned something that night, and once the streets learn something, they never forget. Years later, this photograph would stop being just an image and start becoming a warning. Not framed on walls, not sold at auctions, but passed around in stories, described in hushed voices by men who understood what it really represented. The moment power was redefined without a single shot fired. What this image came to represent wasn't defiance. It was restraint backed by certainty. Bumpy Johnson didn't win that night because he was the most violent man in the room. He won because everyone there understood he could be, and chose not to. That choice forced the Mafia to adjust, to acknowledge a line they could no longer cross casually. The silence left behind after that meeting lingered for years. Harlem stayed calmer when Bumpy was around. Deals were cleaner. Words were chosen more carefully, not because men became better, but because consequences became clearer. Betrayal didn't disappear, it just learned to whisper. The moral cuts deeper than crime history. In America's underworld, survival doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the quickest trigger. It belongs to the person who understands timing, posture, and when silence does more damage than rage. Respect once lost cost blood to regain. Respect, once enforced properly, costs nothing at all. That's why this image still matters. Because it reminds us that history isn't always shaped by explosions. Sometimes it's shaped by 6 quiet words spoken at the exact right moment. Like this video if this image changed how you see history. Subscribe for real American crime stories. Comment below. What do you think happened next?